Franz, thank you very much for the introduction, and Megan for making the process of setting this all up so smooth. And thank you all for deciding to spend your Friday morning with me to talk about issues around setting up implementation studies, which some of my colleagues suggested they tend to be esoteric. But I tend to be very excited about methodology, as you will realize over the next half hour to 60 minutes or so. So it's, as Franz said, it's probably easier, not least because this is a virtual event, to do the Q&A at the end, not least because it is my intention today to spend a bit less time talking and a bit more time in Q&A, because essentially what I will share is an experience that we've had with a large research team on a large-scale national sort of implementation study. I really want your views and your thinking, because what we faced, we thought we might not be the only people in the world to be facing. Indeed, we're not. And that's what I'll share. But we did it through the rather dry process of reviewing literature and talking to very few people. But I'm pretty sure that I can gather the collective experience and intelligence that's in this group to think about some of the issues, I think, in terms of how we evaluate success or effectiveness of an implementation process. This is really what I want to be talking about today, regardless of the field in which you apply you apply implementation methods, whether you work in health or elsewhere. All of my work so far has been in health, with some more recent work in the sort of social care sectors. So I'll say a couple more things in way of introducing myself, so you know who's talking to you as I pull up my slides to make sure you can see them. So this is telling me that you can, so I'll put them on slide mode. Okay, there we go. So it's I should be saying to you good evening, because I'm now sitting for the last sort of 6 months or so. I'm sitting in and living in Singapore, where I moved in April to head up what this behavioral implementation science intervention. So the first center of its kind in this part of the world. So again, very keen to learn from what you guys are doing. I've had some excellent collaborations with colleagues from your end of the world over the years during my tenure at King's in England. And again, a lot of time spent on developing and discussing and debating sort of methods. So these are my contacts. Please feel free to reach out to me if any of the stuff that I'll present today sounds remotely interesting to you. Always very happy to talk. And in fact, because we're a new center, we've got capacity to follow up on some of the questions that we'll be tackling today. So essentially today is me sharing some reflections on experiences that we've had and decision-making that we had to go through, processes of informed, I hope, decision-making that we had to go through in designing a control group for one large-scale study. But that led us to thinking a bit more broadly about how do we think about control groups in the context of implementation studies, and what is it that we're controlling for, and what should it be that we're controlling for? What would make sense in the context of an implementation study, and is it the same as what you would normally do in a clinical effectiveness, a very traditional two-arm control versus intervention clinical effectiveness study? This is the sort of the area that I'm going to be getting into with my talk. So just so you I'm consistent with what I said to you, I'll do. You might have seen these as the objectives of the talk. So I really want to go into the sort of nature of what we're controlling for and why in the context of implementation studies, and particularly trials, because we can control in several scenarios, but these are the easiest to sort of conceptualize. And there's a ton of them getting published in the literature. So what's the aim of and the rationale for us deciding what we're controlling for? I'll present some case studies, and I will start with one, which is the big study that we're now about to finish, and we're just sending papers out to journals as we speak, which is a large study that I concluded with colleagues while I was still in England. It's a UK-wide sort of study. And then essentially I'll be sharing some tensions that we came up against in the process of designing the study in the first place, but then also running the study. So this is not a one-off. These were not one-off questions that myself and the rest of the group had to deal with, but there were questions that kept arising over the best part of a year and a half while the study was designed, and then the study, or the first part of the study, the first phase of the study was up and running. So essentially, think of today as the way I'd like to think of today is a story. So I want to share a story of a study, and I decided to do that because we don't often do that. I mean, I would normally present you 3 or 4 studies, and people never get to see the detail. But for a change, in the context of this study, we decided to go in a bit of detail, and that's why I want to share with you. And I want to seek your help to try and understand some of these issues and discuss some of these issues in a bit more depth. So where's my thinking sort of situated? I mean, you might have seen this graph or different versions of this graph several times. I mean, we sit at the sort of top right quadrant of this graph. Essentially, we're really interested in studies where the primary question is one around implementation. This is where implementation research in one way or another tends to be situated. I'm not making a huge amount of assumptions about how many of you have experience with sort of controlled or trial type studies of implementation, hence this slide and the next one. So in the context of studying implementation, a relatively new thing that sort of hit the literature about a decade ago is this concept of hybrids. So, and again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, these are sort of early papers on hybrids. There was a very nice review and update on hybrids in the journal that I have the pleasure of editing recently. But Jeff Curran, who's in the University of Arkansas in the US, sort of came up with this idea in a rather descriptive manner with his colleagues just over 10 years ago in medical care, in a discursive paper where he suggested that we're talking about this translational pathway from the left to the right as we get into the realms of implementation research questions. So we move from safety to efficacy to effectiveness to ultimately questions around if something has been shown to be clinically effective, i.e. improving patient outcomes in some way, shape or form, what are the best strategies that we can use to implement, scale and sustain so that we can reach those improved clinical processes and outcomes in the long term. And the concept of the hybrids was sort of born. So the idea was that roughly you've got sort of 3 types of hybrids. Hybrid type 1 is essentially what we used to call, and we still do in most places, a process evaluation that's embedded within a clinical trial, typically descriptive. So you study the implementation process and you make some extrapolations as to what might happen post-trial. Then hybrid type 2, which are really complex designs, and I still think we don't really have a good handle on from a methodology point of view, are designs where you prioritize both the data generation in terms of clinical effectiveness, but also implementation effectiveness. So you ideally trial different ways of implementing, while at the same time, you're trialing whether a clinical intervention is actually effective or not. At least that's the theory, and that's the easiest way to conceptualize the design. And the final and slightly easier, again, types of hybrids is the one where I'm going to be spending more time on today, are designs where you don't randomize based on anything to do with a clinical intervention, but you randomize and you evaluate based on the implementation intervention. In other words, the strategies or the support that you use to the activities that you use to support implementation, sometimes called in the literature implementation strategies. So you're interested in the effectiveness of those strategies, and you just monitor the clinical effectiveness or efficacy of your intervention as you collect the data. So this is the space we're at, and I'm particularly interested in the SOAP3 trials because, in theory, again, and this is a conceptual sort of thing, and that hence easy to articulate, harder in practice. We take it as read that something works, and then everybody gets the very same clinical intervention in the context of the trial, except that the randomization works on the basis of the different types of implementation support, the different types of implementation strategy that people receive or organizations receive. So that's a nice, clean, conceptually designed to work with. And I'm focusing on this because these are the sort of designs that we had in mind when we set up the study that I'm going to talk to you about, and we then looked at the literature. So why did I get into all this? Why am I doing a whole webinar on control groups, and what was the prompt? So hence the thread of the story that goes back about 3 to 4 years now. So here is the prompt, and in fact, this goes back more likely 6 years or so. So this is a trial, a very traditional clinical trial, which we call OAC-1. Now, OAC is an acronym, and we didn't come up with this, a sort of clinical acronym. It stands for obstetric anal sphincter injury. So it's an injury that we birth naturally without any sort of cesarean type of intervention may suffer, which is essentially an anal tear, which happens once the baby's head's appearing. So the head's crowned, and at the end of that tear. These are pretty terrible because they have lifelong consequences. There is pain. There's consequences in terms of sort of sexual function, in terms of urinary function, in terms of all sorts of things. Women need reconstructive pelvic surgery often to recover from these, and some of them they never fully recover. So it's a pretty bad things to happen to you if you're a woman in that situation. And we know from the literature, I haven't put all this literature here because this is all the clinical stuff, that the rate of those has been going up globally. So either because they get recognized more or because women choose not to have surgical intervention, so they go for natural birth or for whatever other reason. But the overall rate in Western countries has been going up. So this was something that in the UK, it was felt that we need to be doing something about. So essentially, clinicians got together in the first place and following reviews of the literature and a whole sort of convoluted process, they came up with a so-called care bundle, which is a way within sort of improvement science speak to say, we need to apply all elements of this bundle to see a hypothesized improvement in the outcomes of these women. So what are those elements? The elements are in the box. So there's 4 things that we need to do, we thought, based on the literature. Is first of all to inform and communicate with the woman about the risks and what can be done to minimize them. That's antenatally, so before you go through the process of giving birth. During birth is to have a process of manual perineal protection because there's good evidence that this can support the perianal area and reduce the chances, the likelihood of a tear. When indicating episiotomy needs to be performed at a certain degree, because again, there's good evidence that prevents, is a surgical intervention that prevents a tear, and therefore you can control it, but you need to do it properly. And upon completion, so once the baby's out, when the whole process is done, the perineum should be examined manually. So that's a rectal examination, a manual rectal examination, a digital, so with a finger, rectal examination. And that's a rather controversial element. It has been a controversial element since the beginning. And this is important because we're going to come back to this. So it was good enough based on the literature. And then, of course, a trial was designed, which was in the UK. So the evaluation was, the primary outcome was the rate of obstetric anal sphincter injuries following introduction of the bundle. So the evaluation was over 55,000 births, live births, because that's the sample framework. It was a step wedge design because we wanted by the end of the trial everybody to receive the intervention. The trial was successful, but there was a statistically significant reduction of OAC rates, so the rates of these injuries by the end of the trial. And within that trial, there was a traditional process evaluation whereby we spoke to a small number of women and a small number of providers, and we elicited the sort of drivers and barriers to the care bundle being applied and what could be done and how the implementation should go ahead. So a very traditional clinical trial, effectiveness trial. So this was a real world study with a process evaluation attached to this. So that was done several years ago. We had the results out, they were published. And at the same time, the question arose, how do we now scale this? So great implementation question. We've got clinical evidence. Now we need to move on from that to designing an implementation package. And we started looking at the literature, and there were various ideas about how you scale. But by scale here, I mean across the entire country, across the entire United Kingdom. So how do we scale this? We did not feel comfortable to pick one or another implementation strategy or to create an implementation strategy bundle because we didn't feel there was adequate evidence to suggest one or the other would be evidenced enough really to put our faith in it and to put national resources behind it. So this is where I became very active in designing a sort of hybrid 3 type trial, where essentially we wanted to evaluate implementation strategies based on available evidence. If you look at the evidence base, there's quite a lot said and written and shown about the facilitation as an implementation strategy. So in light of what had come out of the process evaluation, we thought, and the literature, we thought that facilitation would be an active ingredient to facilitate uptake and implementation, but we wanted to sort of study this. So essentially, we designed a two-arm trial. This is a cluster trial with 10 units on each arm. There was a control arm who essentially received implementation toolkits, and you can see the manuals on the slide. So they received those, and they were told, this is all you need to do. You go off and do it. And these units, remember, in the UK, in maternity units, there's a really good tradition of quality improvement. People have done quality improvement projects for several years. There's usually quality improvement leads and resident expertise. And this, we felt it was pretty much the natural way of implementation in the country. So typically what you get once trial results or a new guidelines published, people are given the guideline, given some brief advice, and then good luck, off you go. Tell us how you get on. And because of the size of the country and the complex, perhaps, the services, people are what's the word I'm looking for? They're encouraged to develop local initiatives and good practices to address the local needs and drive local implementation. So this was our control arm, which we call Lean Implementation Group. And then the peer-supported units, where the intervention arm, where essentially they got all of that, plus an active external facilitator who had experience of implementing the care bundle in their own unit. So we selected them from OAC1. So we picked them off from OAC1 because there were people who had done it before. So we paired them with units which were geographically close because we thought they would turn up and have face-to-face meetings and visit the units and support implementation locally. The problem, of course, was that as we were doing all of this, COVID hit. So a lot of this facilitation happened over the phone and virtually. It wasn't quite the same, but I'm not going to talk about the sort of logistical issues that affected this trial today. So this was the basic design. So in my mind, this is a hybrid type 3. Everybody gets the clinical intervention, which is the care bundle, and the difference is in the level of implementation support. The lean units essentially are getting a bit less, quite a bit less, and it's not active. It's just written facilitation with some embedded videos, with the other units are getting, in our heads, we hypothesize quite a lot. So that's the design. Now, this is all nice and easy when I present, and then I can present data and everybody goes, right, okay, this worked and that didn't work. And the data we're still analyzing. But this wasn't a straightforward design in the way we sort of arrived at, in the way I sort of describe it. The first question that we were asked this question quite in a rather pressing manner by a lot of clinicians, including my collaborators, and by people within the funding agency. So we had the very nice scenario where the funding agency was the Health Foundation, who are not the equivalent of big national funding agency, but they tend to get more hands-on involved in study design because they have knowledge of improvement science methods. So we had debates as to whether we need a controlled evaluation in the first place. People were debating whether we need an implementation trial or not. So they were saying, do you really need to be evaluating the efficacy or the effectiveness of facilitated implementation? So we felt that we did, after a lot of discussion and looking at the literature, because we just didn't think that there was good enough, clear level of evidence. There was really good hints, and there's still really good hints that facilitation's got a good theory and some evidence that it works. But even in some of the studies I will cover later, there's evidence that facilitation works initially, and then over time, it levels off. So it adds a quick sort of, you have a rapid uptake and a boost in the implementation early on, and then it levels off when you compare facilitated versus non-facilitated implementation. So it wasn't really clear cut. And on the other hand, we had a unique opportunity, I felt, and this is my bias as a scientist. I told you I'm going to be sharing a personal story. I was really, really keen on doing a hybrid 3 trial. And in the context of the funding agencies that I've interacted with over several years now, almost 10, they don't really understand why you would do a trial without manipulating, without trialing the clinical intervention. So an implementation trial is still a fairly novel thing for a lot of funders. So we had an opportunity to do this. And I thought, we've got a very illuminated funder here. So we might as well do a really well-designed trial to try and understand the mechanism of facilitation a bit better. So I saw this as an opportunity, and several members of the team saw the same. We really wanted to add to the evidence base around facilitation. Now, once we got past this first decision node, which took a while, The second big discussion was, right, okay, we're going to do a controlled evaluation, but what are we going to control for? So this took a very lengthy conversation and a lot of back and forth. So one option which we debated quite a lot was we need to have a group where we do an absolute minimum. In other words, nothing. The guideline would be out by published by national sources and the royal colleges and so on, and I'll say a bit more about them in a minute. We don't need to do anything else. Often, this is the absolute minimum that you see happening when a new guideline gets proposed. In reality, we didn't think that's the sort of the average reality within the National Health Service in the UK. Usually, you get some concept of an implementation manual. You get some discussion around implementation, what to do, what not to do, some case studies of good practices that people often put on websites that are not maintained very well, but they're still there. So we didn't feel that doing absolutely nothing was a representative, if you like, of the reality of our health service. The other problem was, and this is a problem I've been having for several years, we didn't want to make this a so what project. So imagine if we had a control group that had absolutely zero implementation support. They were literally just told, read the paper and then go off and do whatever you think you should be doing. And then we had a group where we literally threw the kitchen sink, like we did everything we could. We had facilitation, we had manuals, we had this, that, and the other. If we did this study and we showed the implementation fared better in the better supported group, and I presented that to you, you would say probably, okay, well, what did you expect anything different? So it's not a very informative study. So medical literature, there are a bit on the so what front. So when you look at medical education studies, of which I've done several myself, we've realized over the years that we were doing so what studies. If you train someone in a procedure to death, they're going to gain proficiency. They're going to be doing it with their eyes shut. But that's not surprising. The problem is we cannot replicate that at scale. This is why medical education trials do not scale up very well. If you do something to a large degree compared to people who don't, you're going to get better. If you offer a huge amount of implementation support compared to zero, they're going to do better. But do you really need an expensive trial to show that? So we wanted to go away from that sort of scenario. And finally, we also thought that it's not that implementation only happens when you have an implementation scientist embedded into a team. Implementation has been happening in health services on some occasions, on very many occasions, very well, without formal implementation analysis, because people have experience, they do the right things, they hit the right barriers. So we hypothesized that the control groups or the lean implementation would actually not be terrible. We thought that in some units at least, and perhaps in most units, people would, using their own experience of introducing an improvement in their units, they would do something reasonably good. And then we wanted to see how much we could push that up by offering facilitation theory. So that was a hypothesis there. We didn't expect, nor did we want. So deep down, we didn't feel that if the trial showed that if people are given the manuals, they're doing an absolutely terrible job of implementing, that wouldn't be good news for a national health service that's been doing improvement for 20 odd years. So we didn't really think that's going to be the case. But of course, you don't know unless you collect the data. So that was our sort of rationale at the beginning of the study. So if you look at wider, so these were very particular aspects of control group selection that we faced, but we thought there's wider issues here that we need to consider. And this is the sort of thing that started to open up our thinking into the sort of wider implementation literature and the wider literature, not just implementation. So a few years back, in working with implementation studies and scale-up studies in global health context, where usually you've got far less resource, so we're talking about countries in Africa, countries in South America or in the middle of Asia, where you've got very low GDP, very low resources, very low staffing levels and skills levels. We came up with this sort of problem, which we sort of articulated in this paper with my colleagues, which we call contextual equipoise, because we wanted to really articulate the problem of transplanting a guideline or a process that seems to work in Canada or in the UK or in Singapore or in Australia, and assuming blindly that the very same thing is going to have the very same outcomes in a very, very different context. So we wanted to convey that in the same way as you think about clinical equipoise, where you say, I genuinely, my hand on my heart, do not know whether a clinical intervention will be effective. there are occasions where we feel that genuinely we do not know whether the context is going to have such an effect that any intervention or any implementation strategy will basically be useless because the context is totally not supporting it. So we felt that this might apply very well in the maternity units that we're looking at because we're just not sure. We think we know the context, but do we really know maternity unit from maternity unit in the UK at least? They can be very different in terms of staffing, whether they're academic or not, in terms of the volume, in terms of the culture. And unfortunately, our maternity units feature every now and then in the news for all the wrong reasons because you've got babies that die where they shouldn't have, mothers that get harmed where they shouldn't have, and so on. So the context, when people say context is king, we thought that we will sort of, this needs to drive our thinking around implementation, control group selection. So that is quite important. So we're truly on equipoise on this. We also have some ethical considerations, and this is a conversation that continues to this day. Clinicians were asking us, we've got good clinical evidence that we've got a care bundle that works. Should we really be doing this as a trial, or should we just be doing everything we possibly can to facilitate implementation? Because the more we delay the implementation, the more we study the process rather than fully supporting it, the more potentially mothers are coming to having these injuries, are coming to harm. And therefore, is this ethical? So this is only ethical because of contextual equipoise. If we knew that there's a strategy that's going to work everywhere and going to improve outcomes equally everywhere, then we wouldn't be on equipoise. And I would suggest we shouldn't be doing an implementation trial. But because we felt that this is ethically justified. But you might raise the question, is it ethically justified? And it's definitely, in my view, not ethically justified in this scenario to do nothing in the control group, because that would definitely slow down. We didn't want to do that. And finally, there were some practical considerations. So forget about ethics and equipoise. We were told very bluntly that in the context of the current service pressures and staffing pressures, trying to set up a national study in UK maternity units would basically fail unless the units got something in return. So units would basically turn us down bluntly to our face. We cannot support yet another research project. We do not have enough people to deliver the service. Forget about it. Just go away and do your study in another unit. If we did this, we would structurally exclude units that had the lowest staffing levels, typically non-academic units. So we would basically do everybody a disservice. So we decided that we can't really, the study would be totally unfeasible. So we would harm implementation by doing this, and we would not really conclude scientifically valid results. So practically, we couldn't do the study unless we offered something in the control group that they would see value in. So that were all considerations that we went through. And we're talking about painful discussions over weeks and weeks, informed by evidence to try and get to the design that I showed you earlier. But this didn't stop there. Then the study launched. And we thought, right, we've got everything behind us. And now we're going to do what you tend to do in the study. You sit back and you wait until the results come back without, avoiding any biases and contaminations and everything else. But that wasn't very easy to do because as the study took about a year, and the units were coming live at slightly different time points, and COVID, of course, intervened with all this. We find ourselves that we were often in our trial meetings, we were trying to figure out whether we were asked to manage a study and facilitate the running of a study compared to actually offer implementation support to the control group and therefore contaminate the study design and harm the study design. What was the problem? The problem, and here is context is king, sort of the phrase that fits well again. The problem was that the study, by design, the entire OASI work, so that goes back almost 10 years now, by design, the work was designed with researchers and clinicians, and the two major national organizations in the country, so the Royal College of Midwives and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, were in the driving seat from day one. This was done because everybody felt that if the study is led by academics, the scale up, if the study is successful, will never happen because it's going to be yet another academic trial that no one's very interested in. But if the study is led by the prime clinical organizations that look after the professions, then we've got a better chance, assuming positive trial results, like we did have in OAC1, to succeed, as in to have some traction with the policymakers and with the practitioners on the ground. So this was done by design. But the result of this was that because there was a lot of pieces in the news. So these injuries are pretty terrible. And a lot of people, including a lot of women, are very vocal about avoidance of these injuries. So when the results of the first study, the first trial came out, there was news stories, there were commentaries, people were debating elements of the care bundle. They were debating the perianal, so the perectum examination. They were debating the positioning of the hands. We're talking about very detailed critiques or debates around the actual clinical intervention. So if you think about the nature of the intervention and how convincing and persuasive that is, people were debating that regardless or despite the trial findings. So units were reaching out to us, and this tended to be the control units because they didn't have anybody else to reach out to, seeking advice as to what to do with the information that we're getting, with the debates that we're getting, how to respond, and whether we could sort of facilitate meetings. So essentially, they were reaching out to us to facilitate when some of these sort of news stories were breaking out, and they were breaking out pretty regularly. But of course, at the same time, sort of practical questions around, that you have when you run a trial. So the data collection could be slow. Remember, COVID had hit at that point, and everything seemed to freeze for a while, and people were having difficulties in reconfiguring their services. The recruitment rate for women could be slow in some units, and then we had to support that, and so on. So when I remember the weekly conversations that we were having as we were running the trial, from my point of view as a scientist, because I'm not a clinician training, right? So I often felt that we need to be clearer in drawing the line between supporting the study, so making sure that the study is feasible, so we don't end up with no data. So I don't have a story to tell you today or any results, compared to supporting the actual implementation process. And there were occasions where we had to really make a conscious decision not to say or not to do certain things that the units were asking us to do for this reason. So as a result, for example, the units were reaching out to us in the first part of the implementation process, which took about 6 months, suggesting that the way we were proposing that they implement is not appropriate and they wanted to improve it. So for the first six, if we had said no to that, the units were basically about to jump off the trial. So they said, this isn't going to work otherwise. So essentially, we allowed the first 6 months of implementation for edits to our implementation, the suggested implementation process that we had put in our manual. But then we decided that now that's it and it doesn't change anymore. So we need to see this through to the end of the trial, because otherwise we have an intervention that keeps changing, and it might change so substantially that the units would have been exposed to a very different type of intervention, facilitation intervention by the end. Or the control groups would have had some sort of facilitation because of the amount of work that they were doing themselves in reaching out to us to help them out. So this was a sort of thing that kept some of us awake at night when we're thinking about how the study was running, because we wanted to avoid, by trying to be helpful so the trial kept running, but at the same time avoid contaminating the control group in particular, and being facilitators where in reality there shouldn't be any. So in doing all of this, at some point we had this sort of idea that, we kept debating amongst ourselves, and then we thought, okay, it's unlikely that we're the only people in the world having this problem. So let's just look at the literature and try and inform our thinking. So what I'm going to present you next is what we decided to do to sort of inform our decision-making process, and we did so based in the literature. So we decided to apply some good old scientific thinking and study our own challenges and share those with colleagues. So we did two things. We did a rapid narrative review, and it had to be rapid because we needed it to inform the process of running the study. And the aim of this review was to identify control group designs and implementation studies have been published, particularly type 3 studies, because we really wanted to know how people control, what they control for and how. And secondly, we wanted to, once we knew what these studies were, we wanted to find studies to develop a typology of those studies, like what types of controls you have, then figure out whether any of those studies look like OAC2, which is our study, and talk to these guys and say, how did you manage your control group? And did you have similar tensions between managing the study versus sort of contaminating your control? So this was really the study was born out of necessity. So we designed this as phase 1, do the review, phase 2, talk to a select few group of people, in an effort to try and understand their implementation process in terms of how they're implementing their control groups. And we came up with a very brief semi-structured interview protocol that we tailored depending on the study that people reported. So I'm just going to share what we found through this process. So through the review, so we started off with about 670 study reports based on our search strategy, and through successive screening, the usual title and abstract, and then all the way to full text review. We ended up with 45 reports to include in a table and then to try and sort of synthesize. And the interesting thing that came out is this typology of control groups in these studies, which essentially boils down to two major types, one of which is much more prominent than the other. About a third of the studies did the so-called A versus A plus, where A was a baseline implementation support and A plus was all of that plus something else. Okay, so there was an overlap between the types of implementation support. It's just that one group, the intervention group, got more and the control group got less. And this is really what we did in OAC2. This was the type of control group that we had. But there was a different type in about one third in about just over half the studies, the A versus B, where essentially the comparison was between two very different packages of implementation support, two very different types of implementation support, which did not overlap at all. People were doing fundamentally different things, hypothesizing fundamentally different mechanisms, and a couple of studies that we couldn't really classify for the purposes of our work. So this was quite illuminating because we thought we found ourselves in a minority, which we hadn't sort of thought about that would be the case in the beginning. And then we picked up a couple of these studies and we reached out to them. And I've summarized the studies here, and I've put the references there. So all of these are open access. You'll have the slides after this, so you can look up the studies. So essentially, you can see our study at the bottom. So that's OAC2. I've already described it. So essentially, everybody gets a toolkit. That's the control group. And then in the intervention group, they get implementation support in addition to that toolkit. So lean versus enhanced implementation. This was a very similar design to the study above, which was the so-called catch-up study, which was done in the US, and it was about implementation of a tool that supports insurance. And obviously in the US, due to the way that their systems, this was done with community-based organizations, and due to the way they get reimbursed for services, obviously working with insurance companies is absolutely paramount. So essentially what they were trying to do, they were trying to implement this novel tool, and their was between a lean implementation group that basically got educational materials, and almost analogous to OAC2, they had an enhanced implementation group. We had all of these materials plus an in-practice facilitator. So again, the concept of facilitation being over and above written passive information. And interestingly enough, we found a study, the physical activity for everyone, the very top one on this table, where that was done in Australia and it was done in schools. So essentially, there was a control group where people did nothing. So essentially, they were told, go off, here's a program, good luck. And they did absolutely nothing except if a school had a question, they had a helpline. So it wasn't really helpline, but they could sort of call the research team and they would clarify the question for them, and they wouldn't do anything else. So some of the schools never got anything else, never got a phone call, never got anything. But for the intervention group, again, they had a facilitation. So interestingly, you see all these studies we picked because they're comparable. They had an internal facilitator to facilitate the implementation and work out implementation strategies within the school so that these physical activity programs can get implemented. So, and we obviously talked to these people subsequently. So we reached out to them and we had these conversations. And from the interviews we did with them, we've sort of summarized some of the key messages for me. So first of all, I was very pleased as a human being doing research in this field to see that the tension between being completely hands-off in a very traditional clinical trial manner and try to manage queries and questions that arise in our control groups in these implementation studies was present everywhere. People said, and yes, we spend some time trying to figure out what we say, what we don't say, and how much we support so as not to compromise the study design. So it was interesting that in the catch-up study, which was done in the US community centers, community care centers, they organized meetings to respond to sites' requests for assistance. So they did in a fairly organized manner. But when they did have those meetings, they didn't do anything more other than signpost them to the original material that these control sites had received. So they were responsive, but they didn't do anything more to keep to the study design. As I said, the physical activity for everyone team offered reactive support. So they didn't do very much other than when a school reached out, they said, yeah, here's what you need to do. Goodbye and good luck. And we did, as I said to you, we did pretty much what the catch-up study did. We had some initial conversations. We had meetings with the study sites. We kept referring them back to the implementation manual materials. And in the first part of the study, we improved those manuals because of the feedback of the units, because they were saying that your manuals are not implementable the way that you've given them to us. So instead of them dropping out of the study, we took their feedback on board. But in the second half of the implementation period, which was 6 months, we kept those constant. The other thing that we had, which I don't know if it's on this slide or the next one, is that no, it's on the previous slide. We had requests because of the amount of publicity around these type of injuries and the intervention. We had non-study sites in the country reaching directly to us and saying, we need the manuals. We need to be doing something about this. We know your study is running, but we're going to be doing something anyway, so you might as well give us the manuals. So we waited for some time. Thank you. We waited for some time, and as soon as all the study was up and running, so all the units had received their intervention, either control or implementation supported, so lean or enhanced implementation support, we then released those manuals to units to ask for, because we didn't really want to do that, but we couldn't not do that because we would be going against the flow of the entire country. And essentially the ask to the team was, you're trying to support implementation. There are units who want to implement. You can't stop them from implementing. So you might as well give them that we have. We are aware that the study is still to conclude, but we can't stop things from happening. So it gives you a sense of the tension between research time and what was happening on the front line. So this is basically where I'll conclude. You see, I'm telling you what we did, and you can critique it and you can tell me what you think, because that's what we're doing next. If you want the full story, we reported it. This paper came out a few months ago. So there's a whole story, as I just said it to you, with all the materials that we did, and you can see all the studies that we found documented in this paper. Here's all my clinical and scientific colleagues there. And I will leave you with some questions. So I will not leave you with a conclusion because I don't have any. We finished the study and we're looking at the results and we're writing it up. But I want your help to think about these, not least, I think these are important for any studies that we do. And these are, in fact, part of my research strategy for the new center we've set up in Singapore. What is ethically justifiable as a control group, in your opinion, when we're doing an implementation study? And, in what context is a control group justifiable at all? So how do we balance the need that we all have scientifically to validate internally a study to make sure that we will say something causal and meaningful about the efficacy of an implementation strategy compared to the lack thereof, versus the need to be pragmatic in terms of how we scale things up without withholding too much implementation support that people switch off really what we're trying to do. Are traditional study designs way too static for an implementation process, especially because like our study took 3 years to complete? For some people, this is still way too long, and implementation was moving much faster than that, at least in England. And finally, adaptation was something that kept coming up again and again and again. And how do we manage that process in the context of running a study, adaptation of the implementation strategy, I mean, in a way that doesn't compromise the study design, how we report it? We have some really cool frameworks to do that, but they're not used very much yet, like Frame.is, for example, is one that comes to mind. So a few questions for us to think about in the final sort of 15 minutes of this webinar. And I hope I presented you with a sort of the inside story of how a trial, which you're hopefully going to see published, was designed and produced these results. So thanks for your attention. It's absolutely brilliant to be able to have this conversation with you. And we have all the remaining time for questions and any thoughts that you may have about what I just presented. Thank you. Franz.
I'm just inviting everyone now, please, if you have any question, comments, would like to jump in the bandwagon, and because there was a nice welcoming to contribute ideas. Either you write your question in the chat and Megan will say it to our invitee, or you please raise your hand, and that would be nice. Also, you open your camera if possible and ask your question to our invitee. Yes, I see one. Oh, okay, no. So we have a few questions on the side. If you're a little bit shy or like to think a bit more about your question. So Nick, I will start to warm up the crowd. So you've referred a lot to the word ethical, which is, so crucial to societies. So a question is, what control group, if any, is ethically justifiable in an implementation study? But what I would like you also to maybe provide more details on is, how do you define being ethically relevant? Thank you.
Yes, and I think this is again, this is another nice example. I could do a webinar on that paper on contextual equipoise, because we were struggling with this in the context of doing implementations in Africa in particular, because that's where most of my global health work has happened. So I think by ethical here we mean, are we truly on equipoise in terms of implementation strategy? So and this is debatable, you see. Sometimes it's debatable, even the clinical evidence, people would say. So some people actually had the view that if we feel that they felt that there's enough evidence on the effectiveness of facilitation, that we shouldn't be trialing facilitation. So if facilitation was our selected method, we should just go ahead and offer facilitation to everybody and do some sort of quality improvement project so that we facilitate in real time implementation nationally and sort of take it from there. We took the view that people talk about facilitation. There's some really nice models like Paris or iParis, implementation theories of facilitation, very good. We used all of that in creating a logic model for our intervention. But the evidence base is, including, if you look at some of the studies, I think Catch-Up's a really nice job of showing that facilitation has a diminishing effect over time. It wasn't very clear. So where do you draw the line? At that time, we didn't feel comfortable that we had enough evidence on facilitation to say to an entire country and to a funder, give us, £500,000 because we're going to drive a massive sort of facilitation effort across the country. And the other thing that I've seen, and this is just me reading the context of implementation in the NHS in the UK, which may be very different for you guys, and you've got a different sort of organizational system in the country, rather organizational. This is almost the baseline. People expect a level of facilitation and championing every single time a guideline comes out. So pretty much guideline comes out, some sort of professor or president or general secretary comes out and says, right, we're doing this because it's a great idea and I'm going to be role modeling this and my team is doing this and everybody should be doing it. So there's I'm caricaturing it, but there's an element of that. And sometimes facilitation isn't delivered properly. So the implementation of facilitation is problematic. So I think it's worth studying how facilitation works and what type of facilitation you get in the context of an implementation process. But of course, I'm conscious that as I'm saying this, and I don't know how many of you are clinicians, when we were talking to a senior clinicians, I mean, Rani, who was my colleague and a co-author, she's the president of the college. We're talking about the people who have responsibility for women's health and their outcomes. She was like, you do realize that to some degree, this sounds like a very academic question to me. I need to improve that's my job, to improve women's outcomes. And to some degree, I see this my job as a scientist. I'm not doing theoretical science, I'm doing very applied science. But we did discuss and collectively took the view that our hands on our heart, we're on equipoise contextually, that facilitation will work in the way that we wish. So that's why we did the trial in the first place. I think ethically, if you feel, France and colleagues, I would propose to you, if you feel as a team that you can't put your hand on your heart and say, I wouldn't withhold this from a patient or from a member of the public because we know how to implement and we shouldn't be delaying to do a trial, then you shouldn't be doing a trial. Therefore, there's no control needed. But it's not an easy decision to make, or sometimes it is an easy decision to make, but sometimes it just isn't.
Okay, so quite interesting. And as I say, I was caught by this question of how you define ethics. So I don't know if anyone here would like to respond to this, who has also a reflection upon this. But is ethically I would say, I wouldn't call it relevant, but what is it exactly regarding control group? That's, I guess, what you brought, Nick, in terms of clinical equipoise, in terms of implementation in equipoise. You call it contextual equipoise, but I understand a bit of implementation equipoise. Am I right to say so?
Yeah, I mean, we say ethical because I think it's got wider issues, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you could translate the implementation equipoise because
Okay.
that's where the question is really.
Okay. Because so I'm a clinician. I do 2 days of clinic a week still. So certainly your exemplar are very clinically relevant. Thank you very much for that. Any question here from the crowd? Because I do recognize many names. Okay, this is Nick addressing us all, but I see many names of people and friends and colleagues who may want to raise. Okay, is there another? Do you see one? Okay, so there is a question, Megan, from Evan McInshern. Sorry if I. So thank you, Nick. Can you expand on why a type 2 hybrid trial is more complicated than type 1 or type 3? Thank you very much.
And I've put a couple of thoughts as we're going through in case people wanted to jump in. So that if you're trying to evaluate, essentially you're trying to evaluate two things at the same time. So one is a clinical outcome and another is an implementation outcome. So let's say we're doing the OASIS studies together, we would have to design and power a study based on live births. And at the same time, we would have, and that would be the answer to try and answer the question, does the care bundle work? And then the other question would be, does facilitation work? Then we would have within that, so once the units have received that care bundle, to either randomize or non-randomize, but compare different ways of delivering the care bundle. So the design of that study statistically is a very complex animal. And it is also practically, it's hard to deliver the interventions at the right time and sequencing. Some people are talking about 3-arm studies where you have a control, both clinically and from an implementation point of view. Then you've got 2 intervention groups where you've got an intervention delivered in 2 different ways. Then you've got a 3-arm trial rather than 2-arm trial. There's still statistical considerations when you do this, which are not very clear. It's not as clean cut as a 2-arm comparison. And our statisticians usually have nightmares trying to design those. So, and what is the primary outcome is one of the key. It sounds simple, but it's one of the key difficulties that statisticians have. How do you design the size of that study and you run all the study calculations based on that? That's very easy. If I say to you, we've got a reduction of 20% in the OAC rate, this is what we're going to use to power the study, compared to also often the lack of any data on an implementation outcome like uptake, a quantitative outcome that we would be able to use to power the study. So in hybrid ones, you do the clinical outcome, you work around the clinical outcome, and typically you do a description of the implementation process, and that's okay because it's simpler to do. And in hybrid 3s, you don't really worry about the clinical intervention because everybody gets it. So you don't have the issue of too many study arms. The problem you normally have in hybrid 3s is try to find prior evidence on the implementation outcome, but you can estimate that in some ways. So that's why the 1s and the 3s I find with my statisticians that are easier to design.
Okay. So Nick,
and to execute, to run.
There's a very interesting point you brought forward, and especially you referred to step wedge. One aspect I would like to hear you a bit more discussing is the dynamic aspect of our trials. When you do our RCT with double arm, I would call it more at the same time everything is happening. I would now understand they're actually static. When you do a step wedge, and each step you implement what has been implemented somewhere before or will be implemented later, including an implementation strategy, you're definitively very dynamic. So is this or was this your experience with step wedge, that they're much more dynamic than a regular RCT double arm?
Completely, but they've got problems of their own. Again, statistically, the statisticians are pulling their hair when you say we had changes between the first step and the second step of the wedge. So the first, like, oh my God, you're changing your intervention. There are some study designs, and I didn't want to go into this because it will make the conversation more technical, and I don't really have personally a handle on them, a good enough handle. The so-called SMART study designs, where essentially you do an iterative study design early on as part of the randomization, so you don't get stuck with here is my control, here is my intervention, and then I've got to do that. And I want to try and get my head around how you do that with implementation strategies, because there might be, our statisticians are saying that it might be the way forward to think about a study design in a more dynamic, iterative manner. But Franz, you're absolutely right. Even by necessity, I would say, in a step wedge, things happen. So when we did OAC1 as a step wedge, it took a year because we had 4 units going live every quarter to get to the final of 16. So things were happening over that space of a year that are beyond anybody's control. And a great example, even the second study, was COVID. COVID happened halfway through the study launch. It was a nightmare. So imagine if you're doing that as a step wedge, it would be a huge difference between the early sites and the later sites. And you can't control for these things. And this is a big problem, the step wedge. At the same time, it gives you some flexibility in terms of how you introduce your intervention. And if that's part of improving and adjusting your implementation strategy, that's great. But this is where smart designs are coming in to solve some of those problems. And I would definitely say I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination here. So I want to try and understand those better for questions like the question we had for OAC2. A smart design perhaps would have been a better design, a more sophisticated rather design to address that question.
Okay, so thank you very much. Heather McLeod made a very insightful comment. Do you want to speak it out, Heather, or you'd like us to have people read about it?
Oh, I was just saying that I experienced this both as a clinician and as an implementer. We are trying to recruit clinicians and they're excited and motivated, but then you need to get funding. And so there was one study where the hospital went and implemented a decision support tool because the momentum was there. People were interested, and it's like, oh no, stop, like the trains left the station where we're trying to kind of get the research up. And then as an implementer of projects, I'm always trying to slow down implementation to be a bit more rigorous, maybe not a study, but rigorous. But then again, I always feel like I'm slowing down clinicians, and it's hard. You want to kind of keep up with the momentum and their interest. And so I just appreciated this conversation and sharing your tensions of what you've experienced on that end.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That's exactly the experience we had. We felt like we're slowing down the entire country by doing the study, and yet there were implementation problems we hadn't even anticipated that were thrown at us during the study, which of course facilitation couldn't necessarily address, and including COVID. So it's the nature of doing implementation research. How agile do you make it to follow sort of clinical pressures and health service pressures? And the answer is, with the best will in the world, science needs its time. And that's part of the tension you're describing and we're all experiencing, I think. Thank you for that, for sharing that.
Yes, very much. So we started a bit late, maybe 3 minutes left. If anyone has, and please feel very welcome. This is what we call the exchange. I would call it a culturally safe environment to discuss our concern as implementers and clinicians. Okay, so Nick, again, thank you so very much. I appreciate even more now your work, because we see that you work so very hard with those extremely large trials. So thank you for your contribution to the field. Thank you, everyone, also for being with us this morning or this afternoon or this evening. Mm-hmm. And have a great weekend all, and hope we can touch base in the near future. Take care, everyone.